Hello, welcome everybody. And I'm going to get started with just a few announcements before our webinar starts. So we're going to be starting shortly, but we ask everybody stay muted until the end, and then feel free to ask any of questions that you have. And then if you have any technical difficulties, please email us or feel free to message me directly through the chat. If you're in the area, please consider volunteering with us. We have a lot of opportunities this year to expand native plantings in Port Washington and the surrounding areas, but also monitoring birds and lots of other fun things like that. Our native plant sale is running until April 15th. So get your orders in. We have a lot of great stuff this year, and a few of those species we'll be highlighting tonight. And thanking all of our partners, funders, and everybody else who makes all of this stuff possible. We can't do it without you guys. And last but not least, these are the future programs that are coming up. So we are in the middle of training for all of our different volunteer opportunities. And then we're giving away free oak trees April 23rd before in a couple weekends after, cleaning up Port Washington and doing some other events with the city. And then our next webinar will be on green infrastructure, including on rain gardens, which I'll be talking about a little bit today in my portion. And if anybody's up in Sheboygan, we're doing World Migratory Bird Day this year up at Coler Andre State Park. And stay tuned and sign up for a newsletter for more details. With that, I'm going to switch over to my actual presentation. So give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to be starting out the series of 3 different speakers talking about 3 different perspectives on native gardening from kind of 2 or 3 different levels of expertise. So though I often am talking to you guys as an expert on bird things, I'm really a novice when it comes to actual gardening. We just bought our first house about 18 months ago, and this is what it looked like when we first started. But to give you a sense of where one person started from, I'm going to be talking about that perspective. And for that, I'll be talking as beginning gardener, entertainer of my neighbors, and someone who just obsessively loves science, which I guess transcends both my professional and personal life. But this is the house as we bought it 18 months ago. I live in Port Washington. You might see this driving by. And so, but we knew that wasn't quite the landscape that we wanted it to look like. So we knew things had to change. And change comes down to kind of 2 big things. Increasing motivation, so having enough motivation to get over barriers. And that comes down to things that are in your way. So you need to make sure that you have enough motivation and energy to get over any barriers you might have. And I'll explain this picture in a little bit. So for me, a lot of it's about birds. So you might question, okay, why is someone who's really motivated by birds? So you might be wondering why someone who cares so much about birds is thinking about native plants. So just as a quick reminder to many of you, but others might be less familiar with this, a lot of our native plants host more insects. So especially Lepidoptera species are really closely adapted to to specific species. And a lot of those that they've co-evolved with over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so by planting those native species, you have basically food for those insects. And then in turn, those insects support birds. And many birds, even birds that eat seeds much of the year, eat insects during the summer, and especially to feed their young. So it means there's more, when you have native plants, it means you have more food for birds when they're feeding their young, and it means you ultimately have more birds. And so that's kind of at the heart of why I've been thinking a lot about birds. So back to what motivates one person to try to really change. If you saw that picture, it's a lot of turf grass and it's a lot of non-native and even invasive species. So what it comes down for me is birds, like I mentioned, but also water. So a lot of ways of landscaping for with native plants actually require less chemical inputs and can protect our water bodies. And this is a picture of a creek near my house that's about just over the street from my house, and that drains into Lake Michigan. So that's something that I've grown up with. I love the Great Lakes, and protecting them has always been something I've been wanting to do. But at the end of the day, I also am human. And as much as I have all these altruistic motivations like saving birds and protecting the lake, it's also about having a space that I can relax in and my husband and I can relax in. So we are trying to create a space that is useful for all of these things. And one thing I just hope everyone thinks about is what's your motivation? Because no matter what, you're going to have challenges. I do. And I'm still learning on how to get around them. But if you can keep tied to that motivation, whatever it is, and it doesn't have to be the same motivation I have, the easier it is to get through it. And so barriers. So for me personally, and again, this is unique to everyone, or each individual person has different barriers. So for me, doing this professionally and reading all the scientific literature on birds and native plants and kind of the ecology of it all, it was an overwhelming amount of information to try to implement in one small yard. So that completely overwhelmed me. And also, I work a lot for the observatory and just not having enough time to do everything I wanted to. And then I was worried that this is my first time. So, like, I was worried that I was going to mess it all up and waste money. So those are kind of the barriers that I was facing, even though I am really motivated to change. So one way that helped me is use plans from experts. So I actually hired Danielle to make a plan that you can see here. Danielle will be our third speaker tonight. And it really gave me the confidence to start trying things. And having that plan to start from really meant that, it was just really a big confidence boost to me, having an expert be able to share that information with me. And even when now I'm starting to be able to tweak it a little bit now that I'm more comfortable. So that really helped. And I also, for a rain garden, used plans that were publicly available. So even if hiring someone isn't in the cards, there are a lot of really good plans that are publicly available, and that can be a good starting place. So this back to the story of us trying to figure out how to create environmentally friendly yard out of this. And it started with removing invasives. And in case it's hard to tell, there are barberries everywhere in this picture. They're small and multicolored. So many varieties of Japanese barberry or cultivars of Japanese barberry were in our yard, and also burning bush. So this giant bush that's just around the left corner of the house was a probably 8-foot tall burning bush. So first things first, getting those out of our yard so they stop spreading. Because if you walk around Port, or if you walk around the natural Harrington Beach or Kohler Andres State Park, you see a lot of barberries, and those have primarily come from landscaping plants. So we didn't want to contribute to that anymore. We're experimenting with how you actually get rid of it in the natural areas in Port. So I didn't want to be a part of that. So that was the first thing. So here's me last spring chopping apart our burning bush. And then the war against barberries, and there were casualties. Our inherited shovel died fighting our barberries. You can see it got cracked there. It won. But we got a new shovel and we continued the fight and eventually got all of them out. So once we like stopped the spread of our yard outside of our yard, potentially with invasives, we started a rain garden. So we mapped out an area, and by rain garden, I'm talking, most people call them rain gardens, but ours is really a sump garden because we have a very active sump pump, and it created all kind of havoc in our side yard. And we didn't realize how bad it was until the spring after we bought the house, because of course we bought it in the summer when it was the driest it was. So setting up an area to promote infiltration of all of our sump pump water was one thing we wanted to do once we realized it was a problem. So remove the sod, graded and amended it. It's hard to tell this perspective here, but it is a divot in the ground. It's hard to tell. And then covering it with erosion control mat to minimize soil just being washed away, and then planting it with native plants. And because I didn't think I would be presenting on this, I forgot to take pictures of actually the little plants being in there. So just imagine all these little guys stuck in here. And then a year later, this is what it looked like. So they're still continuing to grow, but you can see after 1 year, those little tiny plugs are really, really growing. They're filling in. And it also just made me realize how awesome sedges are. If I have any real recommendation, it is if you have wet areas, sedges are awesome. I won't make very few plant recommendations, but that is one that we did have porcupine sedges, and now even after I took this picture, they're even bigger now. So and still a very well-defined clump, which is nice. Especially because it seems like everybody and their dog walks their dog in front of our house, and that's why part of the title was how I'm entertaining my neighbors, because everybody asks what we're doing all the time. And then the next thing we did was expand our beds. So we started by killing a lot of grass using cardboard. So we saved cardboard for a very long time and started smothering our yard after clipping it basically as short as our mower would take it, and then covering it with cardboard, and then covering that with mulch, and slowly expanding it and edging as we went, and continuing on until it had an intermediate sized bed. And that was another thing that really helped us not be overwhelmed by this process, was taking it in steps. So eventually this bed will be bigger, but having an intermediate size that we could handle planting for a year it made it much more approachable for me. So then planted a lot of shrubs for me, because back to my motivation, it was a lot about trying to have host species have support birds and pollinators. So it meant a lot of host species of shrubs. So a lot of our woody plants actually host more Lepidoptera species, so moths and butterflies, than herbaceous plants do. So trying to pick some really high value willows and oaks and prunus species to try to encourage those more of those pollinators. And then for herbaceous plants, the name of the game around here is deer resistance. I can cage the shrubs. It's harder to cage all of the plants, and it also makes it harder for things to fly into them. So at least with the bushes, we have big open top cages, but our deer eat everything. So we're learning what they won't eat, and it comes down to a lot of aromatic species and milkweeds, so that like this butterfly weed. but also nectar sources and more host species. But there are always new barriers. We're always finding new problems, new things that come up. Like I should have, so this was actually a picture when we first, like right after we closed on the house. This should have been a warning of how bad it was going to be with the deer. So there were basically 2 fawns stashed in our backyard, and it was a sign of things to come. They antler rub, they eat things. So we're trying different things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But we're trying to overcome barriers. But again, having that motivation and knowing what's important, yeah, it keeps it going. And just for the reason I'm showing these is we're caging a bunch of our shrubs, and then these are plants that mostly survived our deer. And before I hand this over to Jill, who is a much more experienced gardener than I am, I just would like everyone to think about, what is your motivation? What keeps you going? Or if you're just starting, what is behind your desire to start this? And this is personal to every single one of us. And I'm sure Danielle and Jill have different ones than I do. But keeping that at in your heart, I think really helps overcome whatever barriers happen. So with that, I'm going to give Jill the presenter, and I'll have time for questions at the end. So I'm handing this over to Jill Koonsman, who is a board member of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory and a really knowledgeable gardener.
Excellent, we're good to go. So thank you very much, Jen. And yes, I am considerably older than Jen is, so I have packed more years into gardening. I am also a 6th generation gardener. However, I am a relatively brand new to native plant gardening. I became very interested in it when I started volunteering for the observatory. So that was a big change in how I am gardening. And I have lived in this particular house that I'm in now and gardened on the property that I'm in now for about 35 years. So the gardens here have gone through a lot of iterations. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we think about our yards, and then how I considered changing my approach to my gardening and to my yard. See if I can get this to, there we go. So as most of us probably know, Americans have a love affair with their lawns. And we have roughly 40 million acres of lawn that are maintained, and 2% of the land, that equates about 2% of the land in the United States. So this makes lawn the single largest irrigated crop we grow. Let that sink in a little bit, because think in terms of other crops that we grow and how they might be more useful to us than grass actually is. So this really started me thinking, instead of maintaining a lawn, why instead don't I maintain a habitat? Can I have it all? Can I have the aesthetic of a well-designed shrub and flower bed? Can I reduce the maintenance? At my age, that's a really important question to have answered. Also, can I eliminate the use of harmful pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers? I live on the shores of Lake Michigan. I grew up on the shores of Lake Michigan, and I live right across the street from Lake Michigan now. So I'm very aware of the fact that many of my friends and neighbors, myself included, get our drinking water from Lake Michigan. If we put pesticides and herbicides in our lawns and they get washed into the lake, well, think about that too, and what that implies. So I also started to wonder and think about the fact that could that grassy part of the lawn somehow become attractive and environmentally beneficial at the same time. So living where I do, one of the barriers that I have is I have extremely sandy soil. It is desert quality. So this is about as green as my yard ever gets. And it will only stay this green for probably the first 2 to 3 weeks in May. Then, as soon as the temperature gets above 75, everything turns brown and crispy. The video. This was a little video that I recorded last year because in May, my yard is green for only a couple of weeks. I decided that I was going to do a no-mow May last summer or last spring. And so you can see in my yard a lot of wild purple violets that are native popped up. I had dandelions, wild strawberries. In places in my yard, there are pussy toes, which are also a native plant. So these are all things that, because I did not mow my yard in May, made all sorts of nectar available for the early arriving pollinators. So that was what that little video was about. The question is, does no-mow May really help? Does it do what it purports to do? There are 435 households in Appleton, Wisconsin that registered to be no-mow May properties in 2020 to participate in a research project that was being conducted by 2 Lawrence University professors, Israel DeToro and Relina Rivets. They collected data on the abundance of which is the number of individuals, and species richness, which is the number of species of both flowers and bees that were found in the unmown yards. Participating yards had 3 times higher bee species richness and 5 times higher bee abundance than the nearby parks that had remained mowed or had continued to be mowed. You can see this is a really significant jump in what just not mowing your yard in May can do for the pollinators. The municipalities through the Fox River Valley have continued to participate in no-mow May, as have other communities across Wisconsin. Fort Atkinson, I understand, has been doing this. We're hoping that Port Washington will get on the no-mow May wagon and participate. But it is definitely very, very effective. If any of you get the New York Times, there was a wonderful feature in that just a couple of weeks ago about Appleton, Wisconsin, and the success of this particular no-mow May initiative. Along with bees, I just want to add this. You saw that my backyard was filled with purple native violets. I did not realize at the time that the purple violet happens to be the host plant for the great spangled fritillary. And my yard was just a cloud of these gorgeous butterflies through most of June. And once the violets had finished blooming, these fritillaries found the butterfly weed in my yard. So it was such a treat. So there are all sorts of good reasons, personal aesthetic reasons for having no-mow May. So I have converted my yard to pollinator productive shrub and plant beds, and I've really only retained the grass to connect them. You can see in areas here where the grass is starting to thin out and get brown. So I've just used them as a path, and it works out fine. I now have beds that stretch all the way around the house, and wildlife just has increased exponentially along with the garden beds. I do a kind of a strange mowing job, I guess my neighbors would say, on my yard in the summertime. I find that I have white yarrow that grows naturally in my yard. This used to be a cow pasture at one point in time. And I just allow this to grow up in little islands, and I think it looks kind of cool. When it starts to get a little brown looking, I can just mow it right down so that it's, again, just a sort of a semi-green brown path. This is another one of the beds that is connected through these lawn paths. This is obviously on the front side of the house. And I only mowed my yard 4 times last year. So this is late June. I probably had 1 mowing between the end of May and the end of June. And by allowing the lawn to grow up for several weeks in the month of June, what I now have is a glorious span of Dutch white clover. And I don't know that this is the solution to everybody's deer problems, but I have found that because I know not only have deer problems, I have groundhog problems, I have rabbit problems. And I have found that the Dutch white clover is far more interesting to these critters than are the flowers in my flower bed. So I now can be entertained by watching the small mammals and the quadrupeds and the pollinators frisk around out in my clover patch. And I also have my flowers and shrubs intact to enjoy. So now I've told you what I am personally interested in right now is No Mow May and how it actually has impacted the way I garden in my yard. But I wanted to share with you that in this discovery process that I've been going through about native plants, I have found 2 plants that I particularly love. So on the left-hand side, this is the first time I grew this last year. I ordered this from our native plant sale that the observatory does. This is Azure Blue Sage on the left, and you can see a wonderful bumblebee really getting into this and enjoying it. The color is magnificent. It blooms in the late summer, and I am so enamored of it. I've ordered a whole flat, which probably means I have to dig up more yard, but that's okay. Then smaller garden paths to get to and from. And on the right-hand side, for many years, I was involved in raising monarch butterflies. And instead of raising them now, I am more about creating expanded habitat for them. So where you see the monarch butterflies flitting around, this is a purple hyssop, and they are obviously nectaring on that. But if you look behind the purple hyssop, you will see a stand of common milkweed. So this rather small bed has both a monarch caterpillar nursery in it, and it also has the buffet table for when they hatch out of their chrysalis and they're looking for something to snack on. So I recommend these 2 plants. I absolutely love them. And I wanted to feature just 2, but I can't resist also recommending Joe Pye weed for anybody who is in love with monarch butterflies. So I'm going to jerk you now from glorious spring and summer, which we are all hungering for, into what next fall might look like in your yard if you take this approach. I suggest you go easy on the fall cleanup. Birds can really benefit in the fall and the winter from some plants, from the same plants that pollinators enjoy using in the spring and summer. And so these are some of the plants that really can create winter interest as well as provide birds with some food. So across the top from left to right, there's St. John's wort, right here, purple hyssop, black cohosh, rattlesnake master, and then this is pink nodding onion. I've seen birds on all of these seed heads in the fall, and these pretty much retain their shape all the way until now. I'm just starting to cut them down. So before I start this this is another little video, but it doesn't have any sound to it. I want to call your attention to the very attractive backdrop that I have here. Trellises, lawn furniture, everything that I could possibly think of to create a deer barrier, because I no longer have clover in February or in November. Actually, I put this up in October, because just to the left, what you can't see, I have a stand of tamarack. And the deer, especially the bucks, love to kind of play footloose and fancy free with the waving branches, kind of a Don Quixote tilting at windmills approach, I guess. So these kind of keep the deer at bay. But what I wanted to show you is what happens on this little clump of purple lavender. You can perhaps see on the ground a little bit of action. They're little brown birds on brown ground, so they're hard to see, but there's a canary here, and there's about 3 of the finches in here, and then a number on the ground, and you'll see them flitting back and forth. So I have finches, juncos, chickadees, redpolls, all feasting on plants throughout my yard. And remember, I've got these plants spread all the way around my house. So anytime I look out a window, I'm sure to see these little birds enjoying nature's feast at the banquet table that goes all the way up until now, when hopefully No Mow May will start the cycle all over again. So for anybody who is interested in learning more about No Mow May, here are links to some great resources on the right-hand side. And a reminder for those of you who live in driving distance of Port Washington or Slinger, Wisconsin, April 17th, not the 15th. April 17th is the deadline to order from our online native plant, shrub, and tree sale. And the link for that is right below at the NHIP store. So I have only been briefly catching the questions that have come in. I saw somebody wanted to know what zone I garden in. My mother and I used to argue about this at great length. She insisted that we were in 5B. I've always planted for zone 3 because I like to be safe. I won't be disappointed that way. But if you look at a map, Port Washington, Wisconsin is, I think, in zone 5B, or at least it was the last time I paid any attention to that. So with that, I will turn this over to our next presenter.
Danielle, you should be the presenter now, and we're really lucky to have Danielle here. She is a professional landscape. I guess, what is your title? I know that sounds silly.
I don't know if I really have a formal title. Landscape designer, ecologist, nature nerd, whatever.
Anyway, she is the owner of Native Roots, a really great company. Obviously, I believe that since I hired her to do our design work, but we're really lucky to have her here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about native plants and get excited about this stuff, especially this time of year when we've been waiting so long to get back out into the soil and start planting and start seeing things come to life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about conducting a site analysis of your property, and this is where we start to do the planning process and how we decide what plants we use and what plants we know will work and which ones we can start to experiment with. So the first thing, and Jen kind of talked a lot about this with her presentation, is we want to look at the existing conditions. I have a lot of clients who come to me and say, I just moved in my house and I want to do a landscape design, and I always get a little hesitant because I'm like, well, you haven't lived here for a year, you haven't seen it in every season, and what, those surprises like Jen talked about, the sub pump running all the time, like those are things that we can't always predict for. So it's nice to have a couple months, a year is really good, even more since our seasons are getting so unpredictable with climate issues that we're going through. So being able to see the property during different times of the season is always good. I wish I could do that for everybody, but having the homeowners have that experience is helpful because they can share that with me. So we want to look at like dimensions. Property lines are really important, especially depending on how picky your neighbors might be. We want to make sure that we're doing stuff on your property and not expanding over. Making note of where all of the existing vegetation is. This could be mature trees, could be plants that you have put in or have already been in the landscape. And again, like Jen mentioned, having invasives on your property, making sure you can identify everything that's on your property is really important so that you know if it's a good guy or a bad guy, if it's something that we really need to get rid of, or if it's just an ornamental that hasn't seemed to have any issues, but we might want to keep an eye on it. It's good to know all of that stuff. And other things too, from the house perspective, you know, where's your AC unit? If it's something you want to block, have some screening around it so you don't always see it. And then looking at where your downspouts are, where they discharge to, are they connected to the city, or are they daylit somewhere on the property? Do you have any drain tiles? And then having a sub pump. Being in Southeast Wisconsin with our clay soils, pretty much guarantee that everybody's going to have some sort of sump pump or have some water issues possibly on your property. So making sure you know where all these things are is a great starting point for your landscape design. And then you want to think about the goals. What are there specific species, whether that's plants that you want to incorporate or animals? Do you want to raise monarchs? Do you want to see certain bird species on your property? Things like that can help you lead to what plants you're going to select. Are there species that you want to deter, such as deer? We want to think about that too. Are there features of your landscape that you either want to show off or do you want to block? Do you have a neighbor's property that you know they're always out in their pool or something, and you want to have that privacy on your property? Things like that. Are there views that you want to frame? Do you have that really awesome specimen tree that you want to be able to see and spotlight with your landscape design? Do you want to have like a water feature, whether that's a pond, permanent, or it could be seasonal? And are there any specific colors that you really want to keep in mind with your plant selection? So having those ideas and looking at the illustration that I kind of have some of those mapped out. Like, do you want to have an access to your backyard with a path, certain views, privacy? And then do you have like options like, you know, we want to put a rain garden somewhere because we have our sub pump in that corner and it's always wet in the back corner. So we can kind of start to make notes of the conditions and how we want to address those. We also want to take into account environmental factors. These are things that we can't always control. So sunlight, soil type, moisture, and erosion are some of the big ones. Erosion can be an issue if you have like downspouts and you have a lot of water discharge, having some erosion issues there if you're on a steep incline. People who are along Lake Michigan have a lot of bluff issues. Some of those we can fix with plants. Some of them we might need to do some more heavy lifting and more engineered methods to prevent that. But most of the time, the average homeowner can do a lot of erosion control prevention with just doing landscaping. Soil type is important too because that helps determine whether you have good drainage or if you have a wet area that you need to make sure you got those clay tolerant species that you plant. So making notes about that. Sunlight, is it dappled shade? Is it dense shade underneath those canopy trees that you might already have? And these change. As the landscape matures, you're going to have different plant species that can thrive in different areas as the tree gets bigger. So those are kind of things further down the road that we want to kind of keep in back of our mind when we're doing plant selection as well. The southern side of the house is always going to be more sunny unless you have a tree there. That west side is always going to have a lot of intense sunlight coming on there in the hot afternoon, whereas the east side is going to have kind of more of an easy sunlight. You can get away with like woodland plants there. So things like that are what you want to notice how your house is oriented on your property and in the cardinal directions. And those create those microclimates. So on this illustration, I have, you know, selecting what plant communities we can use to fill those microclimates. So If it's a shady area, we get to use our woodland plants. If it's a wet corner of the property, we can start using some of those wetland plants, those mesic prairie species that can keep their feet wet during multiple periods of the season. We can also use this to create higher diversity on our property. This is where I get excited because we can put more plants in, more plant species to be used. And then in turn, we're providing more habitat and more benefits for a wider range of wildlife. Some of these can be man-made. Like I said, having the sidewalk is going to get hot with our hot afternoon suns in the end of summer. Driveway, salt tolerance, if you're using salt on your property to keep some of the ice and snow off. All of those things are going to affect the soil and then therefore affect what plants are going to thrive there. So here I just got a couple examples. I'm looking at light conditions. So this was a property, even under trees is going to be different. So they had a paper birch, which has, this one they haven't leafed out yet. So it can be a little deceiving on how bright it is underneath there, but birch trees and honey locust, they have smaller leaves and not as dense canopies, so you get a nice dappled sun through those, where you might be able to get away with some species that can tolerate a little more sunlight and not necessarily our dense woodland plants. But if you're planting underneath the spruce trees on the right side of this photo, that's going to be a different plant species and maybe not the same ones that we can use under both trees. So thinking about what kind of tree you have in the species, again, that's why it's important to know what species are on your property. That's going to affect what kind of tolerance they have for shade. And these can change as they get bigger. So if you're planting trees, you're going to have a lot more sun that is underneath them versus when they get into full canopy size. This is another nice little microclimate that was created south side of the house and very narrow, and it's surrounded by all hardscaping. So we have the water drainage, but also just having that reflected heat off of the building, off of the driveway, any salt tolerance. We want to take all of those characteristics into account when we're selecting our plants. Just go out and stand in one of these locations during a 90-degree day and think about a little plant that you're putting in there and how they're going to feel. So we want to make sure we're selecting those right plants. And I should, make sure people know, just because it says drought tolerant doesn't mean it's going to be drought tolerant the second you put it in the ground. So we need to make sure we're taking care of these little guys right when we transplant them into their new home and keep them watered in for the first month or so. Otherwise, they probably will die if you just stick them into this hot environment without any additional watering. And moisture levels. This is another big thing. Is it an area that's seasonally wet? So this is my backyard, floods every single spring, was just flooded, and now it's probably flooded with the rain we're getting again. But then it dries out. So that's okay for some plants, but if it's an area that's always wet, if you have a property that you have a designated wetland on, and you always have standing water, that's something that's going to determine what plant species you can use in that area. But seasonally wet in spring, that's just gonna kind of happen. Things aren't always growing yet, so the trees aren't absorbing water, but once they do start uptaking that water, then we're gonna start losing our moisture content there. So that can be okay for plants. And it also gives us the opportunity to make rain gardens and really cool water features. So at a sub pump, you can put in a pond and use a liner and have a nice little microhabitat there. Really good resource for birds and insects because they have that water. They need water just like we do. Downspouts can be another opportunity to do a rain garden, maybe not necessarily a pond because you don't want all that debris to go into there, but it's an opportunity to put something in, so to use our man-made features and enhance the landscape. You also want to think about visibility and use of the neighbors and the public around your property. If you have sidewalks, how do people use that? Do they use the sidewalk? Do they go off on the sidewalk and create a muddy patch on your land because they're cutting corners? How do we want to address that? Do we want to put a plant there, but we want to make sure we're not growing over into the pedestrian pathway, the sidewalk, or a vehicular pathway if you're next to the driveway? So thinking about who's admiring your landscape and how they're approaching it, and making sure that we're being friendly neighbors in that sense. So now that we've thought about all of these little microclimates, we can start making our plant selections. We're going to do this based off of what they normally occur in. So what kind of habitat do they naturally occur and are found in? So if it's a prairie plant, those might be those ones that we get to use in full sun on the south side of the house. Is it a woodland plant? Those are going to be under the dappled shade of a honey locust tree or a maple tree, things like that. So we can start to make our plant palette and our plant selection and grouping our plants together to create little microclimates, little microhabitats that are based off of what they would occur in nature. And this is a way, we can use host species, we can select those and tag them in there. And nectar sources, we can make sure we hit all of those in each little habitat that we're creating. So we had those habitat areas selected. We had the woodland area, we had the wet prairie area in the back corner. We can then turn that into a plan. So we can use the plant selections that we just did, and we can start placing them in. And the placement is all kind of whatever your personal feel is. If you want it to be more of a mosaic or more of a formal landscape, you can use native plants in a more formal setting with massing and doing it like that. You don't have to just scatter them all amongst themselves. It's totally up to you though. And as they seed themselves and fill in and spread, they are going to kind of blend and mesh in more of a cottage and mosaic type style. And once you have a full plan of your overall landscape, then you can start to phase it in different sections. I do this with a lot of different clients. We select the areas of high priority, usually sometimes the front yard or the foundation plantings, existing beds that they want to swap out with native plants. And then we can start expanding on those. But it's nice to have that cohesive overall landscape plan that we can select what pieces we want to focus on and prioritize. So you can phase it in. I usually tell people to get trees and shrubs in first, because those usually take the longest to get established and get to their full mature height, where perennials are a little bit more instant gratification. Usually within a year, they're flowering and they're filled out. Always start small, start with what you can manage and what you can handle. When people start trying to do everything at once, that's when weeds start to come in, because they're not able to maintain it in those first couple years while the plants are getting established. And that's when you start to get frustrated. You start to beat yourself up that it's not coming in the way you want to. So always start small, and that's the best way. And then you can expand. You can use some of those plants, and you can transplant and use your plants that you have on your property and move them to other areas and expand your gardens that way too, and a little more cost effective. But overall, we want to just support wildlife, so using native species is the #1 thing we're going to do. Jen touched on that with host plants, provide for the insects, and then therefore we're going to provide for a wide diversity of larger wildlife, birds, mammals, things like that as we get up the food chain. And feel free to experiment. Our urban areas have already been modified so much, so we can't always keep it pristine and in the area and in the type of ecosystems that we find in nature. We're going to have to kind of manipulate them. So this is where we can have fun. We can try to bring in new plants that maybe in nature you would never find right next to each other, but in our gardens and in our urban landscapes, we can do that. So keep an inventory too. That's one thing that I've had a lot of fun doing over the past couple years with my property, is keeping track of what plants I have on my property and then what I see using it. So these are all photos from my yard over the past couple years. I've got a lot of different bees that I use the landscape. I got like 6 different bumblebees, monarchs, and different butterflies and birds. So that is what gives me more motivation to keep going, is because of all the wildlife I see using my yard. And I look over at my neighbor and it's just a turf grass desert. So I get excited about what I'm providing. So have fun. That's the biggest thing too. Yeah. That's all I have.
Okay. So now we can open it up for questions. So these can be questions from me, Jill, or Danielle, or all of us. Feel free to either type them or unmute yourself and you can ask them.
How do I stop sharing?
In the like there should be a little circle with a monitor in it. There you go. Perfect. Well, hopefully folks will send in questions, but Danielle, what has been the most fun you've had native landscaping your own yard?
Mine is probably been just all the plants and animals that I've been able to bring in. I have a list. I've got over 100 different native plants on my property, which I think is just amazing for a third of an acre in Glendale. Like, it's nothing huge, nothing fancy. I've had a rusty patch bumblebee,
Oh, nice.
a male, so I'm hoping that maybe one of these years I'll find a worker bee or a queen. I know that I have queen bees nesting. I haven't found their nests yet, but I know that they're here just by the amount of activity that I have and the number of worker bees. So that just gets me excited. And we do nightly walks every time I get home from work. Like, no matter how tired I am, my husband's like, we got to go walk outside and see what we can find. So and getting excited about it too has been awesome, because he's not a nerd like I am about plants. So the fact that he's getting excited and it's like, oh, come look at this bee or something is really cool.
My husband isn't quite there yet, but you should enjoy how much joy I have about it. How about you, Jill? What has been the most fun you've had native landscaping?
I would have to say that it's been, since I started doing native gardening, which has been about 2 years, the exponential growth of the animal population in my yard that is actually not being destructive. So that's, that's fun when you can actually grow things that aren't being eaten.
Yes, I feel that.
I think that, and then the occasional surprise, like the great spangled fritillaria last year, it was like, where are all these fritillaries coming from? I've never had fritillaries in my yard like this. And then just sort of thinking, okay, well, what could they possibly be attracting them, and doing a little reading in my butterfly book and finding that, oh my gosh, my No Mow May initiative is actually hit pay dirt in so many new ways that I never anticipated.
So we have a few questions now. So Elaine asks, how much have you seen of native plants expanding into locations that they could not grow previously? So I think Danielle, maybe?
I mean, I always have my go-to plants that I know are super hardy to use in designs, and some of those are already in the trade. So I think that kind of tells what plants we can select on that. I know I can go to these, 10 species because they're going to grow. But I think that's where a lot of experimenting comes in, because even plants sometimes that I know are going to grow, and I plant them in a client's yard and they don't make it. And that's okay. That, there's some stuff that there's something in the soil that we don't know about that's going on. So definitely diversity is what I always tell people. And I mean, I always try to narrow down my plant selection on plans, but I always end up going beyond. I'm like, oh, I'm only going to use 10 species in this design, and I'm at 20 easily pretty quickly. So diversity is the biggest thing. Yeah, I guess if Elaine, if you want to unmute yourself and kind of maybe go off and explain your question a little bit more, if that didn't answer it.
I did.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I did note when I lived in Juneau County that there were plants that over the course of 15 to 20 years began appearing there that were not there when I first moved there, like oxeye daisies that I used to see down in southern Wisconsin. And I hear people talk about native plants frequently as if they're the end all and be all to that. But I think it's changing the places where they can be grown that they couldn't grow 15 years before. So the old list probably needs some updating.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of like city planners and a lot of restoration companies that are using more southern species, just because we are changing our climate a little bit. I don't necessarily know how I feel about that, if it's right or wrong, but as long as they're native, it can't hurt to start bringing some of those up. But having disturbances on our properties too, that always creates new opportunities for plants. One that comes to my mind is like cardinal flowers, that it will fade out of your landscape, but if you go and disturb that soil, the seeds that are there will germinate a couple years later. So even in your own property, if you have like a large acreage that you're taking care of, you might start to see things fade out one year and then come back in a different spot in a different season. So,
and to Danielle's point, one of the reasons a lot of planners and restoration practitioners are thinking about and actually bringing up some of the southern species is for climate resiliency. So some of our plants that are especially trees that are native here are expected to do well by the end of their lifespan potentially. So there's this tension between what has classically been like what has been historically native to this region and what might expand its range with climate change. And then should you anticipate that or let nature take its course? So there's this tension between practitioners of what's the right way, and different people kind of go different ways on it. But you'll see things like I'm trying to think. Kentucky coffee tree is a southern plant that you're starting to see. Like I know the city forester is experimenting with that in Port, and some north of here too. So you'll see some trees that are they're more Illinois species than Wisconsin, but they're still native to the region. So other questions are, Renee asks, how do you convert lawn to a plant bed? Do you usually smother the grass with plastic or smother it with mulch? So maybe Danielle?
yeah, with our clients, we usually do with mulch, and that's just mostly for aesthetic reasons. A lot of people get a little concerned or think about what their neighbors or other people are thinking about when they see a tarp out on the landscape smothering it. But I do have people who do tarps too. So it's kind of whatever you have access to. I will say with tarping it, you want to make sure you keep it on for a longer period of time, especially if you're using a darker tarp, just because if you're using black plastic or a tarp, the sunlight's not getting to it. So if there's any weed seeds that are there, once you take that tarp off, they're going to germinate. So that's where when we do the cardboard, you have that extra layer that's going to be there longer, but you can plant into it sooner. And you can kind of start to get that succession going a little bit faster. But either one will work. It's just kind of whatever you have available. If you don't have a lot of cardboard, I mean, if you're I have a client who goes to the grocery store at Festival and always gets a bunch of boxes. If you know of anyone who's getting a new refrigerator or new appliances, get on their list to take their cardboard, because those really big sheets are really nice. So if you have that resource, I think that's the nice way to go.
Let's see. Sorry, lots of people sharing that they enjoyed parts of the presentation. Great ideas. Okay, how can we, Lori asked, how can we expand the population of violets in grassy areas? Can we buy seeds?
I think there's some seeds that are available. If you have them on your property, watch in the fall, you'll actually see their seed capsules like open up and they look like little claws and they just have so many seeds in them. So if you have them in a woody or shaded area of your property, which you probably have at least the common violet if you have that type of environment, you can always collect those seeds in the fall and just start tossing them in different areas. That's a really great way to expand your beds too and work in your next phase of your design is by collecting your own seed and sprinkling it into areas. I do that every fall. I start moving things around a little bit each year and adding more in. But I do think Prairie Nursery, check them. They usually have a pretty good selection. I don't know how much Agricol has for violets, but they are available. There are some out there.
I don't think Agricol has violets, or at least they didn't this year. But prairie and prairie moon have a larger variety of seeds. So it's good ideas. Let's see. Are gooseberries and currants native to Wisconsin? Are they beneficial? I need to get a variety I can eat.
Yep, they're both native, and they're both, I don't know if gooseberries are at Johnson's, but black currants definitely are. If you have white pines in your neighborhood or on your property, do not plant them though. There's a fungal disease that goes between and you will lose your white pine. So just keep that in mind.
Which species, the gooseberry or the currant?
I believe it's both of them. It's
Oh.
anything in the ribes family.
It is both, yeah.
But they're both edible, human and animal consumption.
Great. Let's see. Liz, if you're here, I'm not sure about this question about needing a species. Maybe you could explain that question.
She might have been referring to the ribes.
Yes, okay. Never mind. Sorry. Let's see. June has been a challenge finding plants for my dappled sun savanna area. I've added 3 species of penstemon, fire pink for this season. Do you have recommendations for others?
Off the top of my head, because it's 8 o'clock at night, I can't think of any, but if you go onto Prairie Nursery's website, they have a really good, and this is for anything, if you have a specific thing that you're looking for, whether it's bloom time, it's habitat, it's soil type, you can filter out the plants. If you just go to their website and you'll see it on the left-hand side. So you could select, part shade, part sun, whatever type of soil, and June that you want plants flowering, and it will give you a dozen or so plants that you can select from. But yeah, I mean, flowers are really good too. That would be one that you could put in, Monarda or Bergamot.
I would also recommend Morton Arboretum site. They're a little more focused on shrubs and trees, but they also have that that search filter, which is really nice. And you can hit all different kinds of things, like tolerates clay and seasonal flooding, like my yard. So yeah, I've enjoyed that a lot for picking out shrubs. Okay, wait, let's see. Okay, so Karen is saying that she's unfortunately planted a black currant under pines and the pines look terrible. I'm gonna remove the currant, but was wondering if I have this one about 20 feet away. Do you know how far currant has to be from white pines? And if there's anything she can do to help the white pines?
I personally don't know what you can do. I would find an arborist and ask them if there's any treatment that you can do. If you're already starting to see the decline, it might be too late. And I would say 20 feet is still too close. These spores can travel really far in the wind for these fungal diseases. So usually, even if it's just in the neighborhood, it can still affect your trees. It's just like cedar apple rust and some of those other fun ones that if your neighbor has junipers and you have a crabapple, it's going to have that rust spot. So yeah, I would say don't even try to get rid of one of them, unfortunately.
And then, so Liz is saying she doesn't have white pines. Are they considered native? So you're saying that the currant and the gooseberries are native, and white pines are native as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
yep, they're all
the
native.
ones we're talking about are native.
Yeah. And I can't recall if the fungal disease is like an introduced disease or if it is a naturally occurring one. I mean, I don't think you'd find in nature white pines and the currants growing in the same conditions. So I don't think they would actually have that issue in nature. But because, again, like this is where I'm talking about, we've modified our landscape so much in the urban landscape that it can be a good thing that we can play with, but we can also end up coming up with some of these diseases that we don't really have control over.
Yep. I think that is all the questions we have. So I would like to thank Danielle and Jill for being with us. And if you're interested in learning about green infrastructure, especially rain gardens, stay tuned to our next webinar, and we'll be talking about that. And in the meantime, have fun native gardening.